welcome to the Gourmandise School. This is Clémence here with you for the very first day of Bread Camp. We're so grateful and excited that you're ready to join us for 7 days to learn how to make all different kinds of bread, from really simple breads with store-bought yeast all the way to growing your own sourdough starter over the next 5 to 7 days, so that at the end of this week you can make your own sourdough bread. So we're going to start the lessons with focaccia. Focaccia is a very simple sheet pan bread, one bowl, no mixer needed. It's a great bread you can make with little ones that are at home if they're restless. And we're going to weave in some of these like science lessons about the science of bread making as we go between the steps of our focaccia today. So we're going to try to keep this under an hour. There is some magic of television because this bread takes about 3 hours from start to finish, not working the whole time, just with some resting and rising periods here and there. And we're hoping that when you're done making your bread that you'll send us a picture or tag us on Instagram so we can follow along with your bread baking adventures. So let's get started, and then we'll see you at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning Pacific time to answer any questions that you have. If you have questions outside of that time, email us at hotmail@thegourmandiseschool.com and we'll get back to you. We'll be checking the Hotmail line as we have been every 3 hours or so. So I'm really excited and I'm ready to get you to understand the science of bread making with this one super simple sheet pan bread. You guys ready? Okay, so first things first. You want to grab a large bowl. You're going to need the space because this is going to rise pretty dramatically. And only 3 ingredients. So this recipe calls for water, yeast, salt, and bread flour. I really love whole grain flour. It has flavor. White flour doesn't. White flour just comes from the starch inside the wheat berries. So it has a good amount of strength if you're using bread flour, and weaker strength, which is not good for bread if you're using like cake or pastry flour. Those are all white flours. But whole grain flours have a ton of flavor because they retain the germ and they retain the bran, and it gives you a lot of texture. But whole wheat flours need a lot more water. So the recipe I'm about to give you is for bread flour, but I'm going to sub out half of my bread flour, for a whole grain flour called spelt. Spelt is a really lovely variety of wheat that gives you a very custardy interior. It has a lot of great flavor without being too strong. And so I want to encourage you to use whatever flour you have in your cupboards and to not be afraid of like swapping stuff out. So the main recipe calls for 740 grams of water. That means it's about 3 cups. If you have a scale, fantastic. If you don't worry. It's about 3 cups of room temperature water. You're going to need a little less than 2 teaspoons of active dry yeast. It's about 5 grams. You're going to need 850 grams, or about 7 cups, of bread flour or whole wheat flour, or a mixture of the two, which means you might have to adjust your water. I'll show you how. And then you're going to need about 2 teaspoons of flaked salt. So that's kosher salt or flaked sea salt. If you're using fine salt, if that's all that you have at home, use less. Use about 1.5 teaspoons because it's tiny pieces and it's going to weigh more if you were to use a scale. So let's get this started. First things first, we're going to pour the water into our bowl here. And the only tool we're using today is our hand, like a flat open paddle, to mix our dough. And our water is at room temperature. This is really important. I see a lot of recipes that call for warming up your liquid. If your liquid is more than about 115 degrees, which is not that much warmer than your body temp, I hope. If your body temp is warmer than 98 degrees right now, I'm going to ask that you make your bread to share with other people at a later date and just rest and recuperate. But you just want your water to be about the temperature of your hand, because the warmer it is, the faster the yeast activates and rises and works, but also the more likely you are to kill some of it. So I like to just use room temperature water. It'll take a little longer for yeast to wake up, but that's okay. And I'm going to sprinkle my yeast here over the water. There we go. Use your hand, just gently move it about. If you've got the thicker granules of yeast, just let them dissolve for 5 minutes. Not a big deal. Yeast that you buy in the supermarket already has food in it. And if you watched our little lesson about yeast, you'll know that yeast needs 3 things to wake up. When you're buying it in the package, like, I'm gonna reach over here, like this at the store. Ta-da. This is yeast, right there, like this. It already has food in it. It has its food source embedded into it. So when you give it oxygen and water, it kind of wakes up on its own. But remember that. Yeast needs water, oxygen, and food in order to wake up and be able to replicate itself and produce gases to help lift up your bread dough. So I'm mixing this up, and now I'm going to add my flours. So like I said, you can use all bread flour. If you don't have bread flour at home, use all-purpose flour. Your bread won't be quite as tall, but it'll still be great. If you have all whole wheat flour, you're going to need to add a little bit more water because the bran is going to suck up all of that water in your dough. So here's how I do it. I'm going to pour all my flour in here. So this is the bread flour, and then this is the spelt flour, and we get our whole grain flours, most of them from a mill here in the Los Angeles area called Grist and Toll. Nan is the miller, and she's in Pasadena. So if you can get some really great locally milled flour that's grown nearby, use that flour. It's fantastic, and a lot of those mills have a lot of stock right now because our grocery stores are out and people are turning to these much better, fantastic sources for purchasing their flour. So I've got a little bag here. It's Grist and Toll. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is add the salt, and the reason I'm adding the salt right now is because salt and yeast really shouldn't kiss in the very beginning. And some recipes may have told you that like salt will kill the yeast, but that's not really accurate. What's happening is that yeast needs the water in order to wake up, right? But salt likes to attract the water for itself. So when you have salt and yeast together competing in a dough, the salt will always win. So in order for the yeast to like activate itself and be happy, you just don't want them to touch directly. You just kind of want to add them in separate places. So I did the water, the yeast, and now the flour and the salt. I'm going to take a flat open hand and begin to sweep it. I don't want to do this. That gets really frustrating because then you get it all up in your palm. But pretend this is like a rubber spatula, and you're going to sweep like this against the sides of the bowl. And I always keep one hand clean. So one hand is working, one hand is holding the bowl. And I'm sweeping like this. But because I used half whole grain flour, I'm going to need some more water. Spelt doesn't need a whole lot more water. It's not very thirsty, not like hard red wheat. So most of the wheat, the whole wheat flour that you're buying at the supermarket is made from a variety called hard red, and it's really, 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 really thirsty. So you'll have to add a lot more water than I'm going to add. But I don't want this to be a heavy ball of dough before I add more water. I'm going to add it now. So I'm going to get a little bit of extra water, and I like to just pour it in my palm like this and then sweep it in. Again, I'm not doing this. I'm just holding my hand flat and just getting everything hydrated. I want this to feel like really wet sand, or putty almost. The more water your focaccia dough has, the more likely it is to be able to form those big holes inside. Okay, so this is pretty wet. Take a look here. You see the viscosity of this dough? But I'm going to let it rest, and I'm going to let it sit for about 20 minutes before I begin to knead this dough. Okay, so the reason I want to wait is because I want the water to really be able to get hydrated in with the bran and the whole wheat flour, and I also want to let this rest. So I'm going to put this aside and wash my hands really fast. So that we can now talk about the science of bread making. Washing hands is really important right now, so I'm not going to cut that part out. Okay, so over here we have a loaf of bread. So this is a gorgeous sourdough loaf. So this was leavened naturally. That means we used a sourdough starter to power this bread. And actually, I didn't make this bread. This came from Baker's Needed. Thank you for the bread. And you'll notice there's a lot of holes in here. So the holes in your bread dough are caused by gas and steam trying to escape. So when this bread dough is rising, let me show you what it looked like. See this big bubble here? This is bread dough that's rising right now. When the bread dough is rising, the gas that's given off by yeast eating and replicating itself is called carbon dioxide. And the gases are lighter than the bread dough, so they're trying to escape and get out. But because we knead the dough and we take the gluten proteins that are inside the starch of our flour, they begin to form this like chain right here. So all of those gluten proteins begin to link up and bind, and they create these chains. And every time we knead, we get those chains to be more and more organized into a web. So when our gases are trying to escape our bread dough, they're going up, 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 and those gluten webs are stretching to encapsulate them. This doesn't work very effectively or efficiently when we're using weak flours. So if you try to make bread with like pastry flour or cake flour, all of that gas would just evaporate because those flours don't have the very strong gluten proteins that can grow into a really strong web or get organized into a really strong web. So what we want to do is to just use really strong flours when we're making bread so we get this lift. And then again in the oven, those gluten proteins are going to work. All the water that's trapped in our dough is going to turn to steam. And that steam, again, is going to try to get out of the bread, but it won't be able to because we've worked that webbing into this like strong network of strands that'll capture it on its way out. Got it? If you have any other questions about gluten strength of flours, like go ahead and message us or email us at hotline@thegourmandiseschool.com. But that's basically the 101 of bread making. We need our dough in order to develop that structure so it capture gas and steam. That's it. So you can all go home now, turn it off, because now you know everything you need to know about making bread. But the reason I brought up the fact that we're making a lean dough today is because lean doughs don't have anything in the way of gluten development. So lean doughs are doughs that don't have any fat in them. Your baguette, focaccia, these sourdough breads, they don't have any fat in them, and so the holes are really big. Whenever you're making bread that has fat added to it, like tomorrow's milk bread that we'll be making, or challah or brioche, those breads have a lot of fat in them, and fat is really slippery and heavy and makes it really hard for gluten structure to form. So when we're doing lean doughs, that structure forms really quickly and easily, and we get big holes in our bread. And when we're making breads that have fat in them, you'll notice the holes are much smaller, but we get a more tender crust. So that's the difference between the lean doughs and doughs that have fat in them, which are called enriched doughs. I think that we're ready to start kneading our focaccia, little magic of TV. So I'm going to show you how to knead it, and then you're going to do this step every 20 minutes or so for the next hour and 20 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to take our dough right here. Take a look. There we are. It's rested a little bit. You can see it's more slack. So slack means it's kind of like in a blob and it's not very organized. And now I'm going to start kneading it with a technique called stretching and folding. We call it stretch and fold, and we do this technique when we have very high hydration doughs. That means doughs that are really wet, essentially. So I'm going to take a wet hand, because believe it or not, water keeps your hand from feeling really sticky. And I'm going to pretend that this bowl is a big square. And I'm going to stretch and fold this into quadrants. Every time I do a stretch and fold, the gluten proteins will organize them in a stronger and stronger web. Watch. So I'm going to stretch my dough and flop it over. Stretch and flop it over. All the way around. See how I'm giving the bowl like a quarter turn every time so I can stretch those quadrants? And my dough is starting to be less slack and more organized and more taut. You'll be using this technique when you make sourdough breads at the end of the week. So get good with your right hook if you're right-handed and the left arm if you're left-handed, because you're going to need it. Get it? Need it. Okay, so here we go. My dough is starting to resist me. The stronger the flour you use, the less time this will take, because the gluten proteins are so much stronger with strong flours and they organize themselves a lot faster than if you did this with all-purpose flour, for example. So stretch and fold, and then once it starts to really resist you and not really want you to stretch it out, that's when you just let it sit for like 20 minutes, and then you'll come back to it and organize it some more. So what we're trying to do is to stretch and fold it, get it to tense up, then we let it relax, and we come back and organize the gluten proteins again. So tense, relax, organize. So I'm stretching and folding and stretching and folding. All right, it's pretty taut right now. It's not really letting me stretch it very much. So I'm gonna set it aside and wait about 20 more minutes. Okay. All right, so we had this talk about store-bought yeast. And again, I have a little video about a 101 on store-bought yeast on the site if you want to watch it. But store-bought yeast is really efficient. It gets you bread in 3 hours. but it doesn't really encourage you to have a very complex flavored bread. When we're talking about sourdough breads, we're not talking about like that puckery, acidic bread. We're talking about something more complex and more interesting, a bread that has like a sweet tang to it, for example. So what I want you to start doing as we're waiting for our dough to relax before we can stretch and fold it again is to learn how to make your own yeast from a sourdough starter. Store-bought yeast takes about 3 hours start to finish to build your bread up, but when you're making sourdough bread, it's not nearly as efficient. So when we're making our sourdough breads, we're gonna follow the same steps of bread making, but instead of having maybe 20 minutes or an hour between each step, we'll be waiting 6 hours, and that's okay. You know, we have all the time in the world right now. So I'm gonna get out the tools that I need in order to begin a sourdough culture, and I'm gonna encourage you to use the best flour that you have in the house for this very first day, because we want to get everything that's good and yummy. All right, so I need my scale. I have a very small kitchen, and so everything is within arm's reach, even chocolate. So, pardon me while I have some. All right, so this is my scale. I'm gonna wipe her down a little bit. Okay, and I've got water, and I have a jar, and I have some flour. Okay, really important here that you use unbleached flour for this. What we're trying to do is to take all of the yeast cells that live in the flour, that live in the air, maybe on our hands, and get them to come together here and begin to ferment. It's not that hard. I don't even want you to think about it, because if you just do what I say, you will have a gorgeous sourdough starter in about 5 days, all right? So first things first, I want to do equal parts water and flour. If you don't have a scale, I just want you to make it look like thick pancake batter. Don't overthink it, okay? All right, so I'm gonna take about 50 grams here of water. Maybe more, let's do 80. There we go. And about as much of the flour. If you're using whole wheat flour, add a little extra water. There we go. I want you to mix this up. Put it in a sunny spot, slightly covered. There we go. I've got a gorgeous linen napkin. Thank you, Atelier Associé. They're really great people who make linens and napkins from like leftover fabric here in LA. I'm just gonna cover it and put it in a warm spot. Tomorrow, when we're making our milk bread, we'll take a break and we'll take a peek and see what's going on in there, and I'll show you the next step. But this is about as technologically advanced as it gets when you're building a sourdough starter. I don't want you to overthink it. It's just flour and water, and we're gonna let them do their thing. All the yeast that's in here is gonna get everything that it needs in order to start waking up. It's gonna get food from the flour, water from what we put in there, and oxygen, okay? One thing that's really important is the water that you're using. So if you're in LA or any other place that uses chlorine in order to clean their water, you want to either filter it, buy spring water, or pour out the water and let it sit for about 12 to 24 hours so the chlorine can evaporate. Because we don't want anything that's going to kill bacteria, which is something really important that our yeast will feed on. Yeast is not bacteria, okay? But it does need bacteria in order to grow. So I'm going to set this aside. Here we are, and our next step is to give our dough another stretch and fold. Cool? Okay, first of all, I'm going to introduce you to my favorite tool in the kitchen, which is a bench scraper. There we go. It cleans everything up right away. And it also cuts. It's really good for like picking up onions and putting them in a pan. I just love bench scrapers. Okay. We're going to pretend that it's been about 20 minutes. Our dough got more slack. See that? But I'm going to give it some more strength. But for that, I really like to transfer this to an oiled bowl because I don't want all this schmutz around. So I'm going to grab another bowl, put a little bit of oil in it. There we go. Kind of move that around a bit. And transfer my dough. This oiled bowl. All right, here we are. I'm going to stretch and fold. So in a bakery setting, we do this part in these big like plastic containers called Cambros, just like right in there. Okay, I'm going to stretch and fold and stretch and fold and stretch and fold until it resists me. And then I'm going to let it rest so that those gluten proteins that we've tightened up by stretching and folding can unkink and relax so that we can come back to it and give it more organization in about 20 minutes. So again, you're going to do this 4 times with about 15 to 20 minutes between each stretch and fold. And then we're going to do something called letting it bulk rise. And that happens in a blob. Okay? Stretching and folding, it's really resisting me. I'm going to set it aside. Here we go. And talk to you about anything that you want to talk about. So throw me some questions during the Q&A, and I'll try to answer them as much as possible. But a few things I want you to keep in mind. One is your water is important. So try not to use chlorinated water when you're baking bread. Your flour is really important. If you're buying white flour, please buy it unbleached, unbromated, unbleached, because you want it to have some flavor and not be as processed. And as often as possible, please use a whole grain flour. So wherever you can get really great flour at the store from a local mill, it makes all the difference in your bread, okay? I think that we can employ our magic of TV talk at this moment and show you how to shape the focaccia and get ready to bake it. So over here, I have a handy dandy sheet pan. You want to use a light colored pan as often as possible so that the edges of your focaccia don't burn before the center has a chance to catch up. And I'm going to give it a liberal amount of olive oil. Okay, so I have one hand that's got dough on it, which is a little bit dirty, but I'm just going to pour it out. So to go through the steps again of making the focaccia, you're going to pour some water in a large bowl, sprinkle the yeast over it, mix it about just a little bit, and then you're going to put in the flour and the salt. You're going to move it around, decide if you need a little bit more water, especially those of you that are working with whole wheat flour. Move it around, and then you're going to let it rest for 20 minutes. Go back to it, stretch it, and fold it as many times as it takes for it to feel like it's resisting you a little bit, that it's getting really taut. Let it rest. Come back and stretch and fold. Let it rest, stretch and fold, let it rest, stretch and fold. And then you're gonna let it rise for 1 hour. Look at the size of this. It's been about an hour since I did my last stretch and fold. This is called a bulk rise. So all bread making is following all these same steps. Number 1, wake up your yeast. Number 2, mix the dough. Number 3, knead the dough. Then let it bulk rise. Some recipes will tell you to let your dough rise overnight in the refrigerator. Those recipes call for a lot less yeast because time will slowly allow the yeast to replicate itself in the cold environment. But breads that are done in 3 hours have a lot more yeast front-ended in the beginning, okay? Bulk rise means it's just rising in a blob, boom, like this. Number 3 is to shape your dough. After you've shaped your dough, you're going to let it rise again. It's gonna proof. And right after it's proofed, you're gonna bake it off, okay? So for this, I'm gonna oil my hand so I can grab the dough. There we are. I'm pouring it out from the bowl. Oh my gosh, it's so fluffy. I'm gonna pour some more oil on my hand. I'm gonna dimple, 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 dimple. Okay, here we go. Stretch it out like this. So I'm gonna bake this in about an hour. What I like to do is to dimple the dough, and I don't want you to just be like, ee. I really want you to get in there, okay? Dimple the dough, and about 30 minutes in, when you're preheating your oven, when you start to preheat your oven, you're gonna dimple it again, okay? And I like to just add a little bit more olive oil at that point as well. So I want the olive oil to kind of collect inside all these little dimples. I'm gonna stretch it out a little bit. When you're stretching your dough, try not to squeeze it. Again, flat open paddles are gonna reach under, kind of pull it a little bit. And don't worry if it's not perfect. You can totally bake this into 2 8-inch cake pans. You can bake it in 2 8-inch pie pans. You can bake this in a brownie pan, like one brownie pan, 13 by 9 with nice tall walls will give you a really thick focaccia. So I don't want you to like overthink it and go out and like buy one of these. we're all about like using what we've got right now. So I'm gonna encourage you to just use what you have. Okay, so I'm gonna let this sit for about 30 minutes. When I come back to it, I'm gonna dimple it again, and then I'm gonna do some really fun things, all right? So hold on a second. We're gonna pretend like 30 minutes went by. Are you ready? Hold please. Okay, so bread should be dinner. And so I'm going to turn this into like a sheet pan pizza. The main difference between pizza dough and focaccia is that pizza dough has less hydration. It doesn't have as much water in it, which will allow you to like pick it up and be able to stretch it some more. But focaccia doesn't really need all that help. It's also supported by the four walls here. So we don't have to be as careful with focaccia about the amount of water in our dough. And I'm gonna encourage you to make this as wet as you can because you want those really big holes in there. The key, if you want the big holes inside your focaccia, is to use a really strong flour so it can expand and capture all that steam as it's cooking. And then to start your oven a little higher maybe than our recipe calls for. And then after 5 minutes, turn it down. It'll encourage a bigger burst of steam. So if you're going to use a little bit more water, you make sure you're using a really strong flour and then a really hot oven right in the beginning. If your oven's not working and you can't get a technician out right now, this is a fantastic recipe to bake in a grill or a barbecue. So turn your barbecue on to like as high as it can go and then do this in a cast iron pan. Chef Nigel, who teaches for us, is going to do a video on making like a cast iron pizza. No pressure, Nigel. We want to see it soon. But yeah, don't be afraid to use your grill or your oven as long as it can close and get a lot of pressure in there to build so the steam can expand. All right, so we've talked enough. We're going to pretend like some time went by, and I'm going to divide this up into 3 parts. So we're going to do za'atar on one side, keep it classic and plain in the middle, and then maybe do some potato on this side. So I'm going to add a little bit more oil here. There we go. Dimple, 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 dimple. And then I have this lovely spice mix called za'atar, and I'm going to sprinkle it. I like to add a little bit more oil on top of the za'atar, just so it gets really nicely and embedded in there. I don't have a convection oven, but you might. And if you have a convection oven, I'm going to encourage you to make sure that you use your convection feature and to turn your heat down by about 25 degrees. If you have a really strong fan, it's equally important to add a little bit of oil on top so that the fan doesn't blow your herbs away. Okay, and now on this side, I'm going to add some very thinly sliced potatoes. So these potatoes come from the same farmer that we get a lot of our rye from in Sonora, which is a really soft wheat that we'll talk about in a couple of days. It's Alex Weiser, and he grows a lot of potatoes and a lot of lovely root vegetables. And his partner Sherry grows a lot of our wheat. So I very, very thinly slice these potatoes. Do you use sweet potatoes? Get some caramelized onions on here. This is sheet pan pizza. So those of you who remember pan pizza from your cafeteria, I'm going to encourage you to step outside the box a little bit from what your lunch lady used to do. But it's really fun to add a bunch of stuff on here. Make sure that you very thinly slice the potatoes, otherwise they won't cook through. And whatever herbs you have. I had some herbs, but my neighbor's dog ate most of them. She's obsessed with eating any herbs that we use for culinary purposes. So it's just gonna be potatoes. I think on the Magic of TV pan, I had a little bit of oregano left over. So you might see that in a moment. Cool. I'm gonna let this sit for just a few more minutes and then we're gonna bake it. You guys ready? Okay, let me dimple this one more time to get all that goody stuff in there. There we go. And it'll be ready to bake in about 30 minutes. All right. Okay, tiny kitchen means I have to move this whole thing over in order to access the oven, but I believe that our focaccia might be ready. Hold please. And dun-da-da, I think it could use a little bit more time. Take a look. This is gorgeous. We see the za'atar on this side, is plain over here, some potatoes here. I'm gonna add a little bit more olive oil and return this to the oven until I get a little bit more color on there. So you can bake your focaccia plain, like this one here, okay? Or you can add all sorts of fun stuff for dinner on here to please everybody in your family. I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I really, really do hope that you'll join us tomorrow for making milk bread. So we're gonna make like dinner rolls and a classic, just like classic sandwich loaf. And then on Wednesday we'll make a whole wheat sandwich loaf. Thursday is brioche. Friday is challah. But tomorrow at 11 a.m. is our Q&A, and I'm really excited to hear your questions and to see your focaccia. So, really quick reminder, let's go over the recipe. First step, put the water in your bowl. Second step, add the yeast. Third, you're gonna add the flour and the salt. You're gonna mix it just a little bit. Let it sit for 20 minutes and then begin stretching and folding. So stretch and flop it over, stretch and flop it over until it feels a little bit tighter. Then let it rest for 20 minutes, come back and do that stretch and fold. When you're done with your last stretch and fold, you're gonna do 4 of them. You're going to let your dough bulk rise at room temperature for 1 hour. But you have another option here, and that is to put it in the refrigerator overnight. So whatever can happen around 1 to 3 hours at room temperature can happen over like 8 to 12 hours in the fridge. Your yeast is gonna work a lot more slowly. You'll develop more flavor in your dough as well. So let it rise for about an hour at room temperature or about 8 hours in the fridge. Then you're going to take it out and you're going to oil a cookie sheet, put your dough on top, dimple it really well, wait about 30 minutes, dimple it again, add some goodies. You can wait another 30, especially if your dough had been in the refrigerator before. And then you're going to bake it. Bake it till it's like really golden in color and gives you a great crisp crust on the outside. I would show you what it looks like on the inside, but I'll probably burn my hands. But you can see all these lovely big bubbles here caused by carbon dioxide and steam trying to escape, and those lovely gluten proteins that you developed into a strong web when you were stretching and folding the dough. Great job today. I'm sure you've all done really wonderfully. I'm excited to see you tomorrow, and then live before that at 11 o'clock on our Instagram IG, which is at Gourmandise LA. Have a great day and eat chocolate. Bye.